Hi everyone. Today we're going to continue to study plant reproduction. Specifically, we're going to look at the parts of a typical flower and we're going to look at the purpose of each of those parts. If you need to get a hold of me, if you're having questions, please use my email address and you can see it on the screen. If you haven't already, please go ahead and gather up your materials, pencil, science notebook, and color pencils. Let's go ahead and look at some review questions. Our first review question is, name the tiny grains that carry the male reproductive cells in seed plants. We said that since plants are not able to move around their environment, it's important that these tiny grains can be moved around to allow for reproduction. Hopefully you were able to remember that this is pollen. Our second review question, name the process where pollen from the male part of a plant lands on the female part of the plant. So when pollen is transferred or is simply moved from male parts to female parts, we call that pollination. Pollination. And finally, our last question is, list 3 reasons pollinators are attracted to flowers. Hopefully you remember that pollinators show up to flowers not just to be helpful, but there's some reasons that they're there. Why do they show up? Of course, those 3 reasons are bright colors. The entire intent of the flower being brightly colored and smelling good is to help pollinators find the flowers, but pollinators show up most importantly for food. The pollen and the nectar that are at the flower are important food sources for many insects, which covers most pollinators. Let's take a look at our lesson objectives for today. So, first thing I need you to be able to do is I need you to be able to label a blank diagram of a typical flower. So you'll receive a diagram of a flower, a picture of a flower, uh, and the parts will be unlabeled. You would need to be able to label those parts. So you need to know the parts of a flower. You need to be able to identify which flower structures are male and which are female. So when you look at that diagram, you need to be able to say, these are the male parts and these are the female parts. I also need you to be able to explain the basic function of each flower part. So when you look at a flower part, I need you to say, oh, that does this, or just be able to explain why it's important. So let's take a look at the parts of a flower. So this is a pretty typical diagram that is used to look at flowers. And this is a lily flower. Some of you may have some of these in bloom around your home right now. And you can see that the parts on this diagram are already labeled. Okay, so these parts are already labeled. And I want to start out here because I think for some of you this is the most familiar. These structures that are, if you think about it, are a little leaf-like, but they're often have a lot of color with them, and they may be fragrant, they may smell good. These are the petals. Okay, so petals indeed are modified leaves, but these are petals, and these are used to help attract pollinators. Okay, so let's take a look and see what we have here. Okay, here we have something called the stamen. A stamen is made of an anther and a filament, and we can see that the anther is this little knob-like thing here, and we can see that we have several of them. And here is a filament, and the filament is this tiny little stalk. Okay, so an anther and a filament together make up a stamen. Let's take a look over here. Now we have 4 parts to this thing that we're calling a carpel: a stigma, a style, an ovary, and ovules. So a carpel is made of a stigma, which is this very top part here, style, which is this long, thin part here. I would say it's more like a hollow tube. An ovary, the ovary is this outer covering here. So it's this round part here. And then ovules. And we have several ovules here. These ovules are these things that are shown, these 6 things that are shown in the center of an ovary. Together, the ovule, the ovary, the style, and the stigma make up the carpel. Sometimes the carpel is called the pistil. I think this is the most appropriate word. The final bit of a typical flower that I want you to look at are these things down here at the bottom, which really are very leaf-like. So these green leaf-like structures down here, we call those sepals. So let's run back through those. Petal, the stamen, which is made of the filament and the anther. Then we have the carpel, which is made of a stigma, style, an ovary, and an ovule. And finally, we have sepals. So those are the parts of a flower. So if you were given this diagram with none of these words on here, I would need you to be able to label this diagram. You're going to need to spend some time practicing doing that. There's no shortcut here. You're just going to have to spend some time and study these. Let's take a look at the functions. So let's take a look. As we mentioned, I think already several times, the petals, which are these brightly colored and sweet smelling structures or parts, these are used to attract insects. So petals are all about attracting insects. We want to attract insects because they're pollinators, and those pollinators, remember, are helping move pollen from male parts to female parts, which is, of course, pollination. So let's look. So our sepals, let's move down to these green leaf-like structures. So sepals initially are an outer covering. So before this flower opens up while it's still closed and developing, the sepals are actually folded together, and they give the flower this cocoon that it's able to develop in safely. When the flower blooms or blossoms, then these sepals, of course, fold down out of the way. But the sepals, the whole purpose of them is to protect that flower when it's developing. Once it is flowering, they really don't have a job anymore. So let's look at our stamen. So we said that flowers have male and female parts. So our stamen is a name for all of the male parts in a flower, whereas our carpel, which we're going to see in a moment, is a name for all the female parts. So we have two male parts. We have an anther and a filament, but a stamen is just the word that is for all the male parts together. Let's us collectively refer to everything that's male in a flower. So here's our anther. What's the purpose of an anther? So this knob-like structure here. Hopefully some of you on your pollen walk realize that this is where the pollen is produced. If you were able to find a flower that looked anything like this, you can see this little groove or this little split. This is where the pollen is produced. It's where the pollen is created. Remember, pollen contains that male reproductive cell. Okay, so the anther is where pollen is produced. It produces pollen. Our filament, really, this thin stalk-like thing, simply holds up. The filament simply holds the anther up, keeps it out of the bottom of the flower. It gets it up there where it's easier for as pollinators climb down off into this flower deep down off in here to drink the nectar, that pollen falls off on them and they brush up against it. So the filament is all about making sure that the pollinators get brushed with pollen. Let's move over to our female parts. So remember, these two are male parts. Anther and filament are male parts. But when we look at our carpel, which is also called the pistil, the carpel is the female parts. So a stigma, style, ovary, and ovule are female parts of the flower. So our stigma, this is where the pollen has to make it to. We might say that this collects pollen. So pollen has to make it from an anther to a stigma for pollination to occur. Okay. Sometimes this can happen within the same flower. This is called self-pollination. In many plants, though, the pollen from the anther has to make it to the stigma in another flower. So that's an important distinction. Self-pollination, and when it has to go to another flower, we call that cross-pollination. So our stigma, that's where the pollen needs to make it to. That's one of our female parts, and we call that our stigma. Our style. So the style is not a stalk, it is actually hollow down the center. So our style is this hollow passage or this hollow connecting tube that connects the stigma to inside the ovary. So our style is just a hollow connecting tube. This chamber that is going to be around these ovules, we call that, of course, the ovary, and it's really just about protection. We're going to find that our female reproductive cells, called eggs, are within these ovules, And so, of course, this entire chamber here is about protecting those those eggs inside the ovules. And as I just mentioned, the ovule produces, and it of course holds the eggs. And so, very quickly again, our petals are about attracting pollinators. Stamen is all the male parts. Anther produces pollen. The filament holds the anther up, keeps it from the bottom of the flower so that the pollen ends up on pollinators. We have all of our female parts, which is the carpel or the pistil. The stigma is going to be what collects or gathers pollen. The style is a hollow connecting tube. This ovary is sort of this protective chamber that is around the ovules, which contain the female reproductive cells. And finally, our sepal, which really just protects the developing flower. So those are the parts of the flower. And in addition, that gives you the function of each. All right. So today, your notes are going to be just simply to copy and to draw. Okay, so the first thing it says here is draw the diagram of parts of a flower in your science notebook. Please include color and include all the labels and names. After you finish that, you're going to need to write. So you're going to write the function of each flower part. The simplest way to do that is to go back to this part of the video to draw what you see on the screen. It won't be perfect, but do a good job. You're going to need to be able to identify these structures. I need you to draw this, include some color, include all of these labels. And then for your notes, I just simply want you to copy this down. This is going to give you the function of each of these parts. So your notes today should be just to take care of what's on that page. Please know that a big part of your next quiz is going to be labeling a diagram and tell me the function of those parts. All right, let's get to our lab for today. So remember, this is just for fun. I want you to step outside. I want you to look and see if you can find a large flower. We don't want to find something like a sunflower or a dandelion because it's made of many tiny flowers put together. If you can find something like a daffodil, some of you may be able to find some of these that are still in blossom, or if you can find something that's lily-like. One of the things I want you to try to look for as you're trying to decide, do you have a flower, a large flower, is look and see if you can see the stigma and the style, and look and also see if you can find the anthers and the filaments. If you can see those structures individually, then that's a good flower. If you can't find a suitable flower outside, you can ask if you can add a small bouquet of lilies to the grocery list. I know Walmart sells an entire bouquet of these lilies that look a lot like this for a couple of dollars. I think they're just a couple of dollars. Most of you, I think, will be able to find something outside, but if you can't, don't hesitate to go here and ask. If not, that's okay. But once you have your flower, I want you to go inside, ask permission to use a kitchen knife and a cutting board, and I actually want you to cut inside. I want you to start removing, carefully peel those petals away. I want you to take all those filaments off. I want you to snap those off of there and put the anthers and the filaments off to the side. I want you to see if you can see the hollow connecting tube. I want you to look and see if you can see that the style is hollow on the inside. Lastly, I want you to cut open that ovary. I want you to look in the ovary, see if you can spot the ovules. I just want you to dissect a flower today. So hopefully most of you can find a flower outside, but if you can't, don't be afraid to put this off and ask and see if you can get one from the grocery store, or maybe even just from that won't work. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I think that about does it for now. So until next time, stay curious.